Be seated, please. Well,
I just have a few more questions. I retained your services in the latter part of September, early October.
I believe that's correct, yes.
You told us you came into Milwaukee in November.
21st, I'm sorry, November 12th.
I speak up a little. I think you guys speak up a little louder.
Yeah, it's a bit of a buzz if you can wait.
Yeah, there's something hitting the microphone, Your Honor. It's causing some resonance. Okay, thanks. What material did you receive prior to coming to Milwaukee before you met Mr. Dahmer for the first time?
Prior to meeting him the first time, I had the confession prior to seeing him, which was voluminous. I had the charging documents, which were voluminous. Again, I'm trying to think carefully because there have been so much material and it's continued to come on, but those were the major things, I think. And of course, I talked to you several times and so on.
I had traveled to Baltimore to meet with you.
Yeah, I think we've met in Baltimore on 3 occasions, if I'm correct.
And during that period of time, we either shipped you documents or documents were brought to you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. You had the confession.
Yes, sir.
This suitcase that you have brought into this courtroom today contains material, does it not?
Yes, those are that's the material that I've reviewed in preparation for this case.
And that material was sent to you by my office or brought by my office to you?
Yes, sir.
Did you review sufficient data, in your opinion, you would review sufficient data, in your opinion, for you to make the kind of opinion that you made here today?
Yes, sir. I did tell you from the beginning that I wanted to continue to get as much information as possible, and if I were subsequently to see information that would lead me to change my opinion, that I was cautioning you that I would. But I was satisfied at the time that I rendered it that it was correct, and there wasn't anything subsequently that caused me to change my mind.
When's the last time you talked with Jeffrey Dahmer?
Yesterday.
And did you also go to the apartment in question?
Yes, I'd gone to the apartment when I was first in, but only to the outside, and I went back this time to see the inside as well.
Now, I had marked for identification an exhibit, Defense 26. It's not been received, it hasn't been moved into receipt, but if you have occasion to get the information contained therein sent to you for your approval.
Yes, I had most of this information earlier, obviously, because this is essentially a reorganization and update. So I'd seen it in various earlier forms and, of course, seen it this way as well.
Okay. But that information that was sent to you is on a continuing basis.
You were continuing to send me information as time went along. If I had questions, you were responsive to it.
It is not... You know that additional statements were made by Mr. Dahmer, different in some occasions than what he told the Milwaukee Police Department?
Yes, I think I answered. I hope I answered it correctly before. That in most substantive ways, I thought it was the same. I mentioned the business with the holes in the head. I know one thing he had told me that was different, that originally he said with the first killing in Ohio that he disposed of the body fairly quickly. He subsequently told me that it was really a couple of years later when he came back he did. Again, in terms of the big picture, I'm not sure it mattered very much whether the first body was disposed of immediately later on. So there were some discrepancies. There were some things that he said that were different, but in terms of the essence of it, the big picture, I thought he was pretty consistent.
Did he at any time indicate to you what he was going to do with all these various body parts and skulls and heads and things that he was keeping?
Well, again, he would keep them. He would be involved with them in intimate ways. He described elaborately how he would then get rid of some things. There were other things that he kept. We talked about all of that. And, of course, I was also referring to information I had available, which gave me some sense even before I talked to him of what had gone on.
Did he tell you whether or not what he was going to do with the parts as a group?
He told me many things. I think what you're trying to ask me is about one particular thing, because if you're talking about in a group, that's, I suppose, what you're getting at. He had what he called a temple. At times he said it was a temple to him or to the devil. I think he used the word mosque. He didn't always use the same word, but basically it was that. He even, I think, if I remember right, sketched it out, but certainly he described it. And again, I apologize because we're talking about human beings here, but he had this plan of putting a couple bodies on the ends. In fact, at one point, he had hoped to preserve the entire bodies to do it, but couldn't do that, and then instead was saving the bones to do it as skeletons. He was going to, and again, this is awful, but he'd bought an aquarium that originally was going to house one head in the middle. He had these, I forget what you call them, statues that were going to be on the ends. He had this elaborate plan for this mosque or temple, and I think I mentioned earlier, it sounded as if all this isn't sick and bizarre, but it sounded so bizarre. That's where I wondered about psychosis. He'd sort of talked a little bit about being in the presence of these people. And clearly he did feel he was maintaining that relationship by being in their presence in that temple. But he at times was talking about whether he can sort of get powers about things like even money through that. But again, as I pushed him, it was just this sick thing of wanting to be in the presence of these people, sustaining the relationship and doing the setting of this thing he was calling the temple.
Okay, I'm almost finished. I just want to ask you one thing. Looking at the pictures, some of them very grotesque, I think.
No, you're not talking about you're talking about the pictures he took and the police pictures at the scene, or yes, much of that. I mean, it was awful.
The material that you read in the confession, the material that we were sending you as we learned things, the police documents we were sending you, and all of the other material we were sending you, tell us what you relied upon to render the opinion that you formulated on or about January the 10th in the written document you sent, and as you have testified here to in court today.
Well, I'm really trying to look at everything. I mean, clearly, if we had a test that could answer it, we'd have done the test and everybody could have gone home. So we're trying to look at every bit of information and decide what to conclude. I wanted to look at the things he was saying. Was he, for example, saying things compatible with what I would expect to hear from somebody, knowing what I know about this kind of disorder, about the paraphilia? So I was interested in that. I was interested in how what he said applied to the body of knowledge that I, as someone who's worked in this area, how that fit in. I was looking at his behavior and what we could learn about his behavior in terms of it either being consistent or inconsistent with what he had said. Perhaps the analogy, and I want to be careful because if there's concern I'm making too many, I don't want to do that, but I think it's apt, is that, I don't have to count the trees to know that I'm in a forest. And just because there's a little clearing in the forest and I don't see trees right there, if they're all around me, it's still the forest. It was really an issue like that here. It wouldn't have mattered, let's say, that we took away a couple of items. If it had been 14 bodies instead of 16 bodies or whatever, it wouldn't, certainly the case that some of what we see in Mr. Dahmer we can see in other people. But when you put it all together, there were so many trees, to use this metaphor, it was hard to conclude that this wasn't a very ill man, and hard to conclude, at least in terms of how I saw it, others can disagree, that this wasn't a man who'd reached a point where he was just clearly out of control by the time this thing was finally stopped.
Did you ever do any studies on necrophilia or read any studies that were accepted as having a pretty good database for necrophilias?
Yes, well, I'd mentioned, first of all, that I'd seen some people in the past who qualified for that diagnosis. I'd actually seen a teaching film and been involved in a seminar with Dr. Philip Resnick, where that was a discussion a number of years back. I reviewed a number of papers. One was one by Dr. Resnick and another fellow, I've forgotten who. Resnick was the second author, which reviewed, and attempted to review at least the entire world literature on necrophilia. I think they were able to come up with 122 cases. Some were published and some weren't. I've forgotten the breakdown. So I did review the literature and also try to draw a little bit out of some of my own experiences and also out of the factors that are common in necrophilia. There's many things that are different, but some of the ones that are common to other disorders that I've seen.
Not all necrophilia is murder, do they?
No, sir. They divided it, particularly in this article that we're talking about. There's some people where simply getting access to a corpse that's already dead is an aspect of their necrophilia. Now, again, if the theme is, as I've described it here, to begin the relationship in life, have this zombie-like or transition state, and then continuing into death, just going and getting the bodies is not really the enactment of the fantasies. But there have been necrophiles that have gotten bodies out of funeral homes. There have been necrophiles that have obtain bodies in other ways.
You know, do you have any idea how many necrophilias there have been who have been homicidal necrophilias?
It was in the article, and I've forgotten if the number's important. I can check, but it's clear that there's a series that was discussed in that article. Could guess, but I shouldn't. I've forgotten the exact number.
You could, however, look at the data to see whether or not you could refresh your recollection.
Yeah, if it's important and you want me to look at the paper, I can do that.
There are not many, are there?
No, I mean, thank God there aren't many. No, it's rare.
I just want to ask my associates. Please. Getting no response, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Mr. McCann, cross-examination.
Doctor, just so the jury understands, nobody died in that thirst study at Johns Hopkins, did they?
I'm sure the jury understands.
Pardon?
I'm sure, sir, that the jury understands.
We're talking about death, and you cited that study, and what it really showed is that people will drink a little more than the doctor says, as long as we all do a little bit more than the doctor tells us to, and that's what they were doing. Getting a little more water, testing the limits. Just like a diabetic once in a while have an ice cream cone. That happens, doesn't it? That's what that study showed, didn't it?
Well, the point I was trying to make
Just
is
asking. You can answer yes or no. No, this is a skilled verbose who's going to be doing this all the time, trying to add to the response. If it please the court, he either starts answering questions or not.
Disagree, Your Honor. That's not the rules in this state on how to cross-examination.
No, this is going to answer.
He has the right to be responsive. If he doesn't think he is, he can move that it be stricken.
No, this man we know is extremely verbose. We've all seen the flow of words.
No. The doctor will answer the question. And if it's a question that's posed that in a way that it can be answered yes or no, that's the way he will answer it. There may very well be explanations. And under the rules, Mr. Boyle will have a chance to redirect, and certainly he may ask him the unnecessary questions in order to get the explanations.
Doctor, did anybody die in the study at Johns Hopkins?
no, sir, not to the best of my knowledge.
Doctor, there's a difference between a person who has a hunger and a desire to eat, and they satisfy that desire to eat, and another person who has a desire for a dead body and kills to get that dead body. There is a big difference, isn't there?
There are both differences and there are also some similarities.
There's a tremendous intervening prohibition, however, between taking life, and to compare the two, I might break down and eat a chocolate-covered donut and feel badly about it, but breaking down and killing someone is entirely different, is it not?
I hope I made it clear I was not trying to trivialize. I was trying to make a point.
Doctor, let's talk about your initial examination. When you were hired by Mr. Boyle to come out to become involved in this study?
Yes, sir. Well, I'm not sure what you mean by this study. I was asked to come and render an opinion with respect to these issues.
Did you tell him at that time that you had never before testified on the determination of responsibility in a murder case?
I don't think he asked me, and I certainly don't recall stating that.
And you got the materials, you studied some of the materials, is that correct?
Well, I hope I've studied all of the materials.
Then there came a time that you came to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And that was November 12th?
Yes, as best I recall.
And you came and visited with the defendant, is that correct?
Well, I don't like the word visited. I came and did an examination and an evaluation of the defendant.
How did you start the examination?
I started by speaking with him, getting history. I believe I started with the family history, talking about his mother and his father and his background. I think I went through some personal history, talking about his schooling and so on. Talked about various aspects that happened in a chronological time frame in his life. Talked ultimately about the various offenses. Actually made use of an outline that I had, so I didn't have to ask him all the details about those. But it was generally in that kind of a.
How long did you talk about the family history?
Gosh, I didn't time it. Family history, perhaps 15 minutes. I wouldn't want to say that I know that for sure. I think probably 15 minutes.
And you covered the family history from what, 0 to age 18?
Well, again, it's a matter of detail. I certainly satisfied myself that I had enough information to answer the questions I need to ask. I'm not writing a biography about him. I'm trying to get information that's pertinent to the issues at hand, and I was satisfied that I had enough information. Again, keep in mind that the time with him was minuscule, and I certainly knew I was going to get tons of information about aspects of this, so I was in no way sensing I needed to depend simply upon what he had to tell me.
And what did you then talk about after the family history?
Well, again, I think I said after family history, I went into personal history, sort of his development, things when he was younger, schooling, work history.
How long did that take?
Well, again, I don't recall. I saw him in the morning, broke for lunch, came back in the afternoon. I didn't know that it was important to time it, so if I had to remember, it's probably in the area of 5 hours, maybe 6, ballpark figure. It's very, I'm not trying to be evasive, but it's difficult for me to say, gee, I spent this amount of time on this particular aspect of the history.
The jail record book indicates that you spent a total of 4 hours and 45 minutes.
Okay, well, that's
November 12, 1991, visiting
close to 5 hours.
the defendant.
Yeah.
Would that be about accurate? The book indicates 4 hours and 45 minutes.
Yeah, and I think I said about 5 hours.
And you visited with him 1 hour and 10 minutes last night?
Again, approximately. I wasn't timing it. It was probably about that amount of time. Sounds like you were timing it, so
well, yes, I was, Doctor.
Take your word on that.
While you were there for the 4 hours and 45 minutes in the county jail the first time, were the lawyers present at all talking as well?
They introduced me. They did bring in order to save me time, the sort of the summary of the actually 17 killings. He's only charged with 15 here. So they were there briefly, and but almost all of the time was spent with me one-to-one talking with him.
Doctor, if you spent even just 45 minutes talking about first the family history and then the defendant's individual history, that would mean that you have 4 hours left. And even if we said there were only 16 homicides, it would mean that you spoke less than 15 minutes per homicide with the defendant.
I did not spend a lot of time on each homicide. As I said a moment ago, it's sort of a metaphor. I didn't have to count the trees to know I was in a forest. I knew that I was going to get voluminous information about the homicides. I'd seen the confession ahead of time that went into great detail. I'd seen a very thorough investigation done by the police, and so had lots of information. I wasn't there as an investigator trying to get all the facts from Mr. Dahmer about the homicides. I was there trying to make decisions with respect to me being a psychiatrist.
And it's critically important to discuss his perception, is it not, of each of the homicides?
It's critically important that I have a feel for his perception of the homicides. If I've reached at some point a conclusion that someone, this is an addicting-like phenomenon, it's hard for me to imagine that the person's addicted at every moment except for the moments of the killings and then goes back to being addicted. So I wasn't just approaching it of deciding something with respect to each tree in the forest. I was trying to get a sense of the big picture.
Is this addictive a new word now? You're now saying he's addictive to killing? I don't recognize you saying that during your direct testimony.
He sometimes used that word. He sometimes used the word compulsion. The word I would probably use would have to do with drive or driven. I think there are a variety of words to, I think, describe or try to capture what the phenomenon is all about.
Well, let's say you spent then 15 minutes with the family history, half an hour with his personal history. That leaves you 4 hours. What did you talk about during those 4 hours?
Talked a lot about his state of mind. We talked about the kinds of feelings that he was experiencing at the times of the killings. We talked about the kinds of urges and fantasies that he has. Again, in 4 hours or so, you can go into a lot of detail about that sort of material. Those are the sorts of things we discussed.
What was his fantasy?
Well, again, he presents it in a variety of ways. So the fantasy is really something I put together by looking at the big picture. But essentially, they were fantasies that had a necrophilic theme, as I mentioned earlier.
Let me ask what he told you about the fantasy. What was his fantasy or fantasies?
Okay. He told me that he had overpowering urges to kill, to have sex with dead bodies. He described the business of the zombie-like state and how he had feelings of wanting to become involved in people when they were in that sort of a state. He talked about the approximations to the full fantasies that occurred when he'd gone to the bathhouses and how he was involved with people that he had given a drug to and related to them sexually while they were in the
That's
streamlight.
nothing to do with the fantasy you're saying about visiting a bathhouse and so on. I've asked what his fantasy was.
The fantasy there is of having sex with a person who's in this drug-like state.
Did the fantasy include murdering people?
He tells me that as early, I think, as 14 and maybe 15, that there were fantasies that included murder. Yes, sir.
How?
Oh, gosh, I don't know that he talked about the early fantasies of how it was. I remember in...
Were you too rushed to ask him?
Well, he didn't finish his answer. And I know he can do that.
Why don't you refer to your notes? And if you don't recollect about his early fantasies, what they were, why don't you refer to your notes and...
Your Honor, there's no showing that he has to refer to his notes. He can't tell him to refer to his notes. If the doctor can't answer it and has to refer to his notes, the doctor will volunteer that. He doesn't have to look at his notes. He just didn't finish his answer. That's what I was objecting to.
Well, maybe we should let the doctor do the talking. Doctor, are you prepared to continue your answer?
Yeah, I'm glad to answer.
Okay,
It doesn't
go ahead.
matter to me whether I want
Go
the
ahead.
notes should be used or not. But if you want to repeat the question, I'm sorry, I'm distracted.
What was the early fantasy that he told you about?
He certainly told me that early on, and I'd pressed him on this, that he had fantasies that included killing. I believe that he talked early on about sort of clubbing people, but I'm not absolutely sure. Again, I want to stress that the themes were really what I was interested in, the specific details of how he did the killing, and you can differ with me, but as far as I was concerned, weren't that critical.
Did you ask him how does the killing occur in the fantasy?
Again, I don't remember if I asked about each and every one, but we did talk about the fact that he had fantasies about people being asleep and killing them while they're asleep, and the way they would get asleep would be drugging them. We certainly talked a lot about that.
Did you ask him how he was going to kill them while they were asleep?
I know how he did, and he described how he did, so I suppose the answer is yes.
No, I asked you, did you ask him how he was going to kill them in the fantasy?
I'm
You
not
said he
sure
had a
that-
fantasy early on, and I'm asking, did you ask him how he was going to kill within the fantasy?
I'm not sure that I did. I had the confession, was aware of how he had killed each of the victims, so I don't know for certain whether I asked him that or not.
But the fantasy has an important role in this type of thing, doesn't it?
It does, but I certainly didn't have any doubt that these fantasies were present.
But you didn't ask him how he was to kill within the fantasy.
I
is
did
that
not
correct?
go through each and every killing and say, tell me exactly what the fantasy was with respect to each and every killing. I certainly knew the themes, I certainly knew the behavior, and I knew that he was preoccupied because he told me that with these fantasies, that they were overwhelming, that he had tried to resist them, that he'd finally given up trying to resist them.
But you never asked him, how do you kill within that fantasy? You never asked him that.
I'm not sure whether I asked him that or not.
Well, do you check your notes, or did you not bother to make a note on it?
I don't think it's critical.
Doctor, that's for the jury to decide and me to put the question, sir.
Well, if you want, listen, you sound like you want me to look at my notes. If you want me to look at my notes, I'm glad to do that. I'm not sure if that's what you're
Yeah,
asking.
doctor, I've looked at your notes. I can't read them. Would you turn to your notes where that first fantasy and see if you asked him what that fantasy of killing was?
Well, I'm going to object to that unless the doctor needs to look at his notes to answer the question. He doesn't have to look at his notes. Well, how can counsel force him to look at his notes?
Well, I don't think counsel can force him to look at his notes, but I think that he's indicated difficulty recalling, and it would seem to be that's a reasonable thing to do, to look at one's notes. Now, if he feels his notes won't help, we can just go on.
But I do not want to set the posture on this question that his notes then are going to be a subject matter. Unless he needs his notes to refresh his recollection, his notes cannot be pierced in this kind of an inquiry. And I submit that the counsel can ask him what his best recollection is, and if he doesn't have an answer, he doesn't have to go into his notes.
I have his notes. I can't read them. Not legible. Are your notes
I
legible?
know you have my notes. I sent them to you, and I sent them when you asked, but they were notes simply taken from me. I didn't write every word he told me. There were things I would jot down as I went through. I sent you them because I made sure that I had touched base on each of these.
And you relied on that material to guide you in your discussion?
Yes, it was very confusing. Again, I've learned it in detail here, but here are these 17 cases, and this was an extremely helpful outline, and so I just kind of sat that down and began to talk with it.
That was prepared by counsel. Do you understand that?
Yes,
that outline?
counsel, absolutely. Counsel gave that to me.
And that resulted from counsel interviewing the defendant. Is that correct?
With all due respect, I think Mr. McCann, may I have a confession? When we took the confession, that's a first part of that.
The caption says follow-up number 1, does it not?
Yes, sir. The top of the page is follow-up number 1, and then it starts with the name of the first person that you'd mentioned.
Do you know who prepared that?
Well, I don't know which of the attorneys prepared it, but so I'm not the best person to answer all that. I certainly was aware of much of this information, even from the confession, and found this very helpful as a guideline to structure with respect to these victims as I...
Do you know if that was information that counsel took from the defendant directly? Do you know?
My belief is, to answer your question, that it was a combination of clarifications of information that the counsel had in other ways, and then speaking with Mr. Dahmer and making certain that they had it in the most updated fashion. That was my belief regarding it.
In other words, they compiled the police review materials and then conducted additional interviews with the defendant. Is that correct?
That is my belief.
And then the defendant gave that information to counsel, and it was then given to you. Is that correct?
Yes, as a useful outline while I was
And
sitting.
you used that in conducting the interviews. Is that correct?
I used that as a structure that made it easier when I got to the part of the interview. And in fact, if you look at my notes, there's an original box here somewhere where I start going 1 through 12, and then I never fill it in because I was going to go through this myself. And when one of the attorneys handed me this, I was able to put this down, and this made it much easier for me.
Do you understand that counsel is constrained ethically to work zealously on behalf of the defendant? Do you know that?
Of course I know that.
That does not impugn honesty, but you know, as a psychiatrist, if counsel is zealously constrained ethically to represent the defendant, inevitably in filtering through information, there is a good possibility of some distortion, is there not?
I trust that's on a regular academic question rather than on this case, because if it's on this case, I'm going to object to it because there's been no foundation that any of that took place. I don't care about the zealously going to work for your client, but if that's going to lead to distortions, reference to what I did or my associates did, I'm going to object to the form of the question.
It's going to be pointed out if the information passed through counsel, constrained ethically to zealously work for the defendant, then the jury has the right to know that, the basis of that information.
I don't have any problems with that, but he said it contains distortions.
That's not, they said.
I don't think Mr. McCann was suggesting any impropriety on the part of the defense counsel.
Fine, I just think I got to make that clear.
I know as a psychiatrist, I need to be very objective. I also looked at the information the police had. I looked at the information that had to do with quotes the other side. So, I put it into perspective. But again, to follow up on what Mr. Boyle said, I had absolutely no reason to believe that he was intentionally misleading me and providing me with this.
So you did know that it was coming from counsel in some
Of course
fashion.
I knew. It was handed to me.
Right. Did you know that counsel is zealously constrained to represent the client?
Yes.
Inevitably, is it not so, doctor, that from your own background in psychology and psychiatry, that inevitably when the commitment is to argue and present to a jury that the man is not should not be held responsible, that inevitably there's a selection process, that they will feed to you the information that supports such a
Of
finding.
course, that's why I read that suitcase full of material so that I wasn't simply coming to conclusions based only on this. It's why I was talking to Mr. Dahmer myself. It's why I made the point this was simply a convenient structure to guide me as I sat there and talked with him. If I was to come in here and say, I read what the attorney gave me and I've come to my conclusion, it'd be ridiculous. But that isn't what happened.
My point is, doctor, with a 17-count homicide, 17 homicides, 15 counts, it is ridiculous to think you can do it in 4 hours and 45 minutes. Would you agree with that?
Well, no, I don't tell you how to do your job, and I don't think you should tell me how to do mine. I'm very conscientious. This is a very serious matter. I have spent hour after hour. I'd made it clear to the attorney if new information came up, I would change my mind. I wasn't here as a hired gun. I resent that. I spent a lot of time and was very thorough, and the notion that because I used as a guide one little bit of information to help me in asking questions that somehow I didn't do my job right, no, I don't agree with that.
Doctor, you spent far less time than any other of the experts involved, didn't you? Far less time. In terms of interviewing
Perhaps,
this.
and I don't mean to be smart, but you're getting me a bit mad. Perhaps I'm a little bit more efficient. It's not the amount of time you spend, it's the quality of time. It wasn't just the hours with Mr. Dahmer. I wanted objectivity. I spent hours reading the police reports, the investigations, people who talked to his neighbors, people that talked to accusations that were made about killings in other states. I did everything within my power to make certain I wasn't getting a biased view of this case.
And the best way to do that is to talk to the defendant himself, not what the police wrote, not what counsel wrote, not what neighbors said, but to talk to the defendant himself.
And if I'd have
Is it
told
not?
you I spent 6 more hours with the defendant and hadn't done all this, you'd have said, Doctor, you are very naive. You think you can get the answer from talking to him? He's biased. You should have been looking at all that other information to make sure you're objective and fair and balanced.
Doctor,
And I'm
you-
sorry for yelling.
Doctor,
you're
Doctor,
attacking my professional and personal credibility and my integrity.
No, doctor, you're inexperienced. That's what I'm pointing out. The attempt to point out your inexperience. You've never been involved in a murder case, much less a serial murder
Perhaps
case.
you should call the people in the American Psychiatric Association and ask them why an inexperienced person like me is a colleague with your expert witness on that particular committee.
That's a paraphilia committee, is it not?
I'm not an expert on the spectrum of law. I'm not an expert on the spectrum of homicide. I believe this man has a mental disorder that predisposes him to act in this way, and I think I'm very much an expert, and I say it with pride. I'm sorry you're getting me angry, but I'm very much an expert on the issues that are relevant here.
Doctor, you've had no experience, have you not, in handling the determination of responsibility in a first-degree murder case?
I haven't testified about that in a case. You're absolutely right.
Doctor. And you are not a forensic psychiatrist, are you, doctor?
I have no interest in trying to become an expert in the whole spectrum of issues, making wills and ability to decide whether or not the doctor should turn off the respirator and so on, that often is involved in forensic psychiatry. I don't come in here as an expert that knows how to talk in court. I believe I know a lot about the paraphilias. I think that's relevant to the decisions that need to be made here. I have tried my best to communicate as clearly and as effectively as possible so that the people that have to make an important decision will be as well informed as they can be. It's clear you don't like the way I'm doing it, but I'm doing my best to do that, and I'm proud of that.
Doctor, in terms of necrophilia itself, the concept of necrophilia, that means affection for a dead body, does it not?
It's more than affection. It includes all of the things we've been talking about. Here's a man that's having gentle sex with a dead body, that's talking to the head that's been severed, that's seeing himself as continuing on in an intimate relationship by eating somebody.
All right, doctor, did he tell you that he talked to the head? Did he tell you that?
No, he didn't tell me that. I know that because that was in other information that I've read since then.
All right. Why didn't you ask him, doctor? If that seemed so important that you'd cite it now to the jury, if it seems significant, talking to a severed head seems somewhat significant, you didn't bother to ask him about that, doctor, did you?
I did not need, in order to make a decision about whether he had a mental disease, which is what I needed to do, to make a decision about whether or not he was sufficiently enough impaired by that mental disease that he lacked substantial capacity to say to him, Mr. Dahmer, did you ever talk to one of the heads?
Doctor, you've written a number of articles about paraphilias, and in those articles you have said in a number of articles that the only paraphilias where violence is found, basically, is in sadism and masochistic type of paraphilias. You've said that in print, haven't you, doctor?
If you show me that, I'll tell you that I've spoken in a way that I shouldn't have, but I don't believe I've said that.
That's generally where it's found, is it not?
Again, I know what you're quoting. There are a number of paraphilias that can predispose people to violence. I mentioned masochism, where the violence can be directed towards the person themselves. Certainly in sadism, there is a condition called paraphilic coercive disorder that can predispose people to rape. Pedophilia, I don't want to call it physical violence, but there can be real trauma of a psychological nature to a child. I've commented on that in numerous writings. Certainly necrophilia, you'd have to be a fool to argue that that isn't something that can predispose to the most awful and violent of acts. So I can't imagine that you would suggest that I felt that the only violence that you'd ever see would be in sadism. If you have, by the way, you asked me to show you my notes, show me where I said that.
Necrophilia itself relates to the body, does not embrace the concept of killing, does it? There are necrophiliacs that have never been involved in killing.
I probably have it here since I don't need to show you things, but if you want to hear it from there. Anyway, the article by Dr. Resnick that was discussed earlier, I know Dr. Resnick, as I said, I addressed the topic of necrophilia in a conversation with him. Indeed, I'll find it in there. But it specifically says that one of the types of necrophilia is homicidal necrophilia, and it lists the number of cases in the world that fall into that category. That's one of the identified types of necrophilia that's published about in the literature, not by me, but by other people. I just know about it because I try to keep up with what's going on.
Necrophilia itself, not homicidal necrophilia. I'm talking about necrophilia, not homicidal necrophilia. Necrophilia itself involves this urge towards the dead body. Is that correct?
You know, I think I've answered. Necrophilia involves many things. One aspect of one of the things one expects to see in necrophilia is a description from the individual so afflicted that it's usually he, it could be she, but usually he is having intense, recurrent, erotic fantasies and urges, and then the theme of those urges and fantasies should be of a necrophilic nature. It's not that every single person that's ever been written about as a necrophile is a rubber stamp of exactly the same content, but the theme, the idea that it's going to be about necrophilia is going to be there, just as without exhibitionism or pedophilia, it's not exactly the same fantasy, but what they share in common in each of those conditions, in pedophilia, it's about kids, maybe different kinds of kids, different ways of relating to kids, but it's about kids, and exhibition is about exposing, and that's why I tried to make the point that my expertise in the other areas is applicable here. It's rare to see necrophilia, and I can learn some things from the other areas that I have some expertise in that I think are applicable. Anyway,
many necrophiles have nothing to do with killing. Isn't that true?
One of the things in the article I just mentioned, this is, I think,
if it pleases the court, may the witness be directed to answer. It's a yes or no answer.
Yes. I'm sorry. Please ask the question again.
Many necrophiles have nothing to do with killing.
There is a subdivision of.
Judge, that's a yes or no answer. He knows it.
Yes or no?
He knows it's a yes or no.
Answer the question, sir.
The answer is that yes, there are some necrophiles, people who are diagnosed as necrophiles, where killing is not an issue, as I explained earlier.
Persons that work in mortuaries sometimes become involved in necrophilic activity. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
People that work in morgues sometimes become involved in necrophilic activity. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir.
There's persons that have had reported of persons having necrophilic contact even with their wife after death. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir.
Now, in terms of the law itself, just so the jury understands as we draw on, we have the. Subsection 1 is the basic definition in terms of the sanity responsibility law. Just so the jury is fully understands, the person is not responsible for criminal conduct. I'm sorry. Mental responsibility of the defendant, sub 1. The person is not responsible for criminal conduct if at the time of such conduct, as a result of mental disease or defect, he lacked substantial capacity either to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or conformed his conduct to the requirements of the law. In your testimony, you had that in mind, that test, did you not? Just so the jury clearly understands, in your testimony, you have made it very clear that this defendant throughout these matters appreciated rightfulness and wrongfulness of his conduct. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Yes.
So as far as you're saying to the jury, you are in no way saying that he lacked substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So you would say your suggestion would be it's on the second so-called wrong, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Of the law.
Yes.
You're a member of the American Psychiatric Association?
Yes, sir.
And there's been discussions at the American Psychiatric Association about, that's the so-called ALI test for laws, that's right, for insanity. Are you aware of that?
Yes, sir.
There's been discussion at the American Psychiatric Association about that second prong, is there not?
I don't have firsthand knowledge, but the insanity defense is very controversial, so I can't imagine there hasn't been discussion.
I'm not interested particularly in what their position is, except a stated reason that appears in this exhibit. Let me read it for you for members of the juries. From the American Psychiatric Association, many psychiatrists, however, believe that psychiatric information relevant to determining whether a defendant understood the nature of his act and whether he appreciated its wrongfulness is more reliable and has a stronger scientific basis than, for example, does psychiatric information relevant to whether a defendant was able to control his behavior.
Before the doctor answers that, I move that until there is such a foundation as to who it is that's making that conclusion and offering that information be made known to Dr. Berlin and the rest of us, because otherwise it's really immaterial and irrelevant as to what somebody says in a document that we haven't been told about as to who the author is. All I care about is know who the author of those words are. Then I'll withdraw my objection.
We will submit that if it please the court tomorrow morning. In terms of the American Psychiatric Association, are you familiar with that statement, Dr. Dahl? Do you agree that there is a stronger scientific basis for assessing whether or not the person can appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct, that there's a stronger scientific basis for that than there is a scientific basis to say that he can't control his conduct?
No, sir, and I can add more, but if you want to just have yes or no answers, the answer is no, sir.
Do you disagree with that?
Yes, sir.
With that? Would you explain to the jury what a differential diagnosis was? You mentioned that a couple of times when you were testifying directly.
I think I did, but I'm happy to repeat it. A term that applies in medicine in general, to try to consider the various diagnostic possibilities that might be relevant to come to the determination of which, if any, is applicable in a particular situation.
And in this particular, do you recognize where that comes from in the DSM-3R? That particular quote?
I really meant to read it because I wasn't
sure. Do you recognize where that comes from?
I believe it's in the section that is describing aspects of paraphilias, and I would agree, by the way, there's also a disclaimer in the front of the book indicating we shouldn't inevitably conclude in every instance that it's a compulsion and the person is driven. And I hope I've made that point throughout, but I'm not saying, and I agree, that it has to be decided on an individual basis.
Right. In terms of what, because you use the word compulsion a number of times, what this particular portion of the DSM-3R addresses the use of that word, does it not?
I'm going to object to it unless it's in the DSM-3R. Let it be received in evidence. Let's see where the page is and what part of the DSM. That's a big book. Part it's in, so that the doctor may have that to answer the question, not just taking a definition out and saying, what do you think of that?
If you look at page 246 of what's been marked as state exhibit number 27. Yeah, to the left side right here.
Yeah, but this is,
The overhead. At the moment, we're using the overhead, let the witness return to the witness stand and he can, in the comfort of the witness chair, examine the book.
yeah, well, this is, I guess the question is this coming from here? And the answer is yes.
Yes, it is. And it comes from the obsessive compulsive area. Is that correct? Of a different disorder. It's not the paraphilia disorder, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I've tried to get the others in so much, is that there are comparisons that can sometimes be.
And what this, may I quote it in the event the jury can't read it? Differential diagnosis. Some activities such as eating, e.g. eating disorders, sexual behavior, e.g. for example, paraphilias, gambling, e.g. pathological gambling, or drinking, e.g. alcohol, example, alcohol dependence or abuse, when engaged in excessively may be referred to as, quote, compulsive, close quote. However, the activities are not true compulsions because the person derives pleasure from the particular activity and may wish to resist it only because of its secondary deleterious consequences. Is that correct?
Yes, as you know earlier, I disagreed with this observation, but it is certainly correct that that's what is said in here.
And that's the official statement of the American Psychiatric Association about the nomenclature and utilization of words and definition of various mental disorders.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. We have to be very careful with words such as compulsion and to look carefully in each instance as to whether they're applicable.
And what they are saying within the terms of the DSM-3R is that the word compulsion really relates to something that an individual would rather not do rather than something that they desire to do.
They're saying that people do use the word compulsion to talk about the paraphilias, that they want people to be very careful because there are other ways of looking at it, and we have to be certain that we are being careful. That's how I would see this.
A particular compulsion, not uncommon, someone, at least occasionally, certainly a psychiatrist sees it, is the obsessive person who has to wash their hands. They feel compelled to wash their hands. Is that correct?
That would be a good example of one type of psychiatric illness in which there is a compulsion present.
And that person doesn't enjoy washing their hands, do they? They're not doing it because they derive pleasure from it.
They receive a great deal of pleasure, tension reduction. I worked in the Maudsley when I was in England with those folks. They certainly describe an incredible relief, and pleasure, I think, is not an inaccurate term in doing that, and that's great distress if someone interferes and prevents them from doing that.
The issue is relief they get. They don't enjoy washing their hands, do they? The 5th or 50th time that day.
You know, we're maybe splitting hairs. If I'm really feeling greatly relieved and you're going to tell me that's not pleasurable, I'll give it, okay, it's relief, it's not pleasure.
This defendant, Mr. Dahmer, pursued and drugged people to get pleasure, didn't he?
He certainly, and I'm just repeating what I said earlier, the answer is yes, because I don't want to seem to be evading, but as I said earlier, the fact that he was getting pleasure and excitement out of it isn't proof that he could have controlled it.
It isn't proof that he couldn't either.
Well, absolutely. There's no one thing here that's going to prove or disprove it. That's why I said it's important to look at the big picture.
One of the reasons the American Psychiatric Association says that there isn't a real scientific way to prove the second prong is because you can't
Now, hold on a second. I'm going to object to standing here at my table pointing over the shoulder here. Objection to that.
Okay.
I don't know if the court can see it. But
Mr. McCann, take position.
I'm
forced into the corner with this, but we can take it back.
Yeah.
So.
Let me just outline what the rules are, and that is that we examine witnesses either from the counsel table or from a podium. Obviously, there are times when we have to soften that rule a little bit. I think that's one of them when we're using an overhead, when we're using exhibits, that's certainly the case. Let's go ahead.
Jeffrey Dahmer took pleasure, did he not, in the men that he visited at the bathhouses?
He certainly experienced sexual pleasure when he was behaving in a sexual way with them, yes.
There is no doubt, is there, that he preferred live men for those sexual pleasures?
I'm sorry, but I'm not sure I understand your question. If you're asking me whether Jeffrey Dahmer in general is much more aroused and excited and gets more sexual pleasure from dead men than from live men, I think it's much more the live men. He's indicated that he often couldn't achieve orgasm, rarely could achieve orgasm when he was with a live man. He was always achieving orgasm with a dead man with, again, I apologize to people, with parts of dead men. So his arousal, from everything that I can see, is much heightened when he's with a dead person as opposed to a live person.
Did he state, however, that he preferred the person alive or dead?
Well, he said at times things like, I wanted to keep them longer, I wanted to keep them, and again, when he was talking about the alive, it was often in this zombie-like, trance-like state. But when it came to looking objectively at when was it he was able to reach the point of climaxing, which is not just dependent upon what he says, it's clear that he would climax with the dead bodies and rarely be able to do that with the live bodies.
Let me put the question again, Doctor. I asked you, did he say, not what you inferred and so on, did he say that he preferred them alive?
At times he said that, but he contradicted himself on that.
All right, tell us what he said when he was saying it. What words was he saying it when he was affirming that he wanted them alive? What words did he use?
Oh, gosh, I don't know if I remember the exact words, but there were times, for example, when he said, I didn't want them to leave, and I only killed them to keep them, to have them stay longer. And I mentioned in the earlier questioning that I don't buy that for a moment. That's an example, though, he's saying, I really wanted them to stay, and was kind of suggesting that he wanted them to be alive, and he was only killing them because they were going to get out of there.
What words did he say when he said, you said sometimes he said he preferred them alive, and then you said, and sometimes he said he preferred them dead.
Perhaps then I should backtrack because I'm not sure that I heard him say he preferred them alive. I kind of just went with your saying that. So I apologize. I don't remember hearing him say I prefer them alive, but I'm sure he did, or you wouldn't have asked me the question.
Doctor, did you ask him, do you prefer them alive or do you prefer them dead? This is a necrophilia case, you know. Sir, surely you must have asked him, Mr. Dahmer, do you prefer the body alive or do you prefer the body dead?
I asked him what were the most powerful fantasies for him, what were the most powerful stimuli for him. I spoke more in those terms. In fact, the word, if I can please finish.
Well, you didn't ask him.
May I please finish the answer? Because
will you please respond to the question?
I did not use the word preference because DSM-3R purposely took the word preference out of the definition of the paraphilia, because in the earlier versions, and you can pull it out and read it, mistakenly they used the word preference as though you could choose and you preferred this over that. It was recognized that that was a real distortion and that the word preference ought not to be used. And so I talked to him in terms of what was most arousing, what was most of eternal, and so on.
So you never asked. You never asked him, Mr. Dahmer, do you prefer these bodies alive? Or do you wish them alive? Or do you get more pleasure out? Did you say anything about do you wish them to stay alive? Because he told you he was drugging him, could have killed him when they came in the house. Do you know he used tested with chloroform to keep them alive? You know he claims he drilled to keep them alive. My question is, did you ask him? Mr. Dahmer, do you wish you would prefer sex with an unconscious live body, or do you prefer it with a dead body?
The answer is no, I did not use those words to ask him that question.
He did use drugs, did he not, in the bathhouses?
He used a particular drug, and I'm not going to name the name, but yes, he did drug people in bathhouses.
And he got sexual satisfaction from what followed after that, did he not?
Yes, sir.
Climaxed often, masturbated, would rub and masturbate and so on. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Did he know that was wrong to drug a man in a bathhouse?
Yes, sir.
In terms of after you know that he asked to leave the bathhouses, are you aware of that?
I am aware of that, sir.
Because he was using drugs, is that correct?
Yes, sir. Well, because he was giving drugs to other people to put them asleep.
And they didn't know they were getting drugs, did they?
No, sir.
And he was told to leave the bathhouses, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that certainly reinforced his concept that it was wrongful to do that, didn't it?
Yes, sir.
And then he started taking people to hotels. Did he do that? Do you know?
Yes, sir.
How many, do you know?
I think he took about somewhere between 4 and 6. I don't remember. It was 4 or 5 or 6 people to various hotels, drugged them, and did not kill them before the incident in the Ambassador, where he ended up waking up and one of them was dead.
And what was that incident? Do you recall?
At the Ambassador?
Yes.
Yes, sir. It was the first killing in Milwaukee. He had, again, brought a person up there, as we just pointed out, he had been doing before. He'd been drinking heavily. He drugged that person. He insisted he hadn't gone there intending to kill them, and again, hadn't killed several that he'd been bringing to hotels. Says that he woke up dead. He found the man's body crushed. There were bruises on himself. He obviously knew he hadn't, it had to be him, but he insisted he doesn't remember it, and then he had to, because he needed to get the body out, had to go out and leave the body and get something to put it in and so on. That's the general theme of what happened at the Ambassador. That was Mr. Hicks.
Did you then ask him, did you prefer Mr. Hicks when he was alive as to when he was dead?
No, sir.
Obviously, we're
Strike that. Mr. Twomey?
I'm sorry, excuse me. It was Mr. Tomey. Mr. Hicks was in Ohio. No, sir, I didn't ask him.
Did you ask him with respect to this whole venture, all these 15 homicides that followed, that at any point did he prefer the person while they were alive or prefer them while they were dead?
I did not use the word prefer at any time in asking him questions.
Did you ask him to express his wishes in that regard?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, what did you ask him to express his desires? You don't seem to want to fence around the word prefer. Did you ask him what his desires were? Did he desire them more alive or desire them more dead?
I was satisfied that I had a good appreciation of what was the real turn-on for him.
What was the real what?
Turn-on. I'm speaking in the vernacular. What was the most sexually arousing type of relationship for him, if that's clearer?
So you felt that you divined it from that?
Divine it. And I don't mean to be rude. I'm sorry to kind of lose my temper with you, but, you know,
the mystery is why you didn't ask him.
I didn't use those words, and you tell me to answer yes or no. You don't want me to explain anything about what I did, and then you know, if you don't guess the words I used, then I'm going to have to keep saying I didn't answer it that way. I am not trying to be difficult. I almost feel I need to apologize. I've been in court a number of times, and I've never been arguing, but, you know, to say, how did you divine it? I mean, you're I don't mean to be nasty, but you're kind of insulting me with your questions.
Most people, and I'm not a psychiatrist, but most people would ask. It doesn't seem terribly complicated. Mr. Dahmer, do you prefer him alive or dead? They're looking right at
The reason we don't send most people in and an expert is the expert needs to know how to phrase it. And as I said before, we purposely took the word preferred out, recognizing it wasn't appropriate.
Did you ask him that question directly or indirectly?
Indirectly, I tried to
ask it indirectly.
I thought I had told you that I talked with him about what was maximally exciting for him. I talked about the circumstances under which he would achieve climax. I talked to him about the themes that were arousing. I talked about his masturbation fantasies. I talked about how his behavior was or wasn't in relationship to those fantasies. I talked about, could he have, quote, normal sex? I talked about describing what went on with the bodies. He talked about fondling the bodies, having gentle sex with the bodies. I asked him the difference between gentle sex and not gentle sex. I was getting a pretty good sense of whether, and again, I apologize to people, but he talked about masturbating in the mouth of the head of a dead body. I was pretty clear on what was turning this guy on in this sickness. I didn't have to say the words, gee, Mr. Dahmer, and I don't mean this to be cynical, with this guy, what did you prefer?
So you inferred from what he said, but never asked.
I didn't use those words. I weighed into the equation the words he was using, and then I looked at the big picture to see also what his behavior was telling me about what it was that was or wasn't eternal.
And it was from those inferences that you concluded that he preferred a dead body.
No, those inferences were one piece of information that I used in conjunction with all of the other information to see, when I put it all together, what makes most sense. I've got all this information out there. I'm going to look at it with an open mind. What is most likely the case here? When I look at all this, is this most likely a guy that really is into having sex with live people? Did he spend most of his time going to gay bars? Did he spend most of his time picking up people who could have gone consenting? He's not a bad-looking guy. Did he try to persuade people not to leave, offer them money to stay so he could have sex with them alive? On and on and on. Or was the overwhelming theme and looking at everything in terms of what's going on is that the real preoccupation to drive what this guy was really wanting was to have sex with people who were dead. And when I look at all of that and say, what's most likely? You know, I don't have to get into a word, Mr. Dahmer, what did you prefer? Tell me. When I look at all that, I think it's very obvious what's likely. You can disagree with me. You can tell people why you think I'm full of baloney, but that's how I came to my conclusions.
You know, several of the other psychiatrists asked questions, and he made it very clear in his responses to them that he preferred them alive.
There will be an opportunity for them to come in and people can decide what they think. I've told you how I've done it as best I can and why I've done it and the logic of my thinking.
What type of sex did he have with Joseph Bredehoft after Bredehoft died?
Oh, goodness. You will have to refresh me. I mean,
That's the last one, doctor. Take a look. The last deceased. Number 17 or number 15, depending on how you count. Tell the jury what type of sex he had with Bredehoft after Bredehoft died.
Well, again, there's an updated version of this, but let me, since I'm using, this is close. Okay.
Counsel to the police. Take your choice.
This is, I'm sorry, victim 17. Is that how it would be listed?
15 or 17. I know. Great.
Yeah, 17. Great.
See, there should be a section on sex after death. Let me just see if I can. Well, I'll answer what it says, and you don't want me to say more, so I won't. I don't want to go against what you want. But what it says here is that, no, he wasn't as attractive. That's what it says.
Did you ask him that, Dr. Eve? When you're relying on counsel for the answer, or is that your answer that you verified with him from asking him about sex after death?
I doubt very much that by the time I got to the 17th victim, I felt it was terribly critical to know in this one particular instance exactly what he did or didn't do after death. By that point, I had, and it's just how I go about it, but I had a pretty good sense of what I was dealing with. And he said he had or hadn't had sex with Mr. Bredehoft. Given this big picture, it would have been a drop in an ocean and wouldn't have very, very much meant anything to me.
How many of them did he not have sex with after death?
My belief is he had sex with all of them based on everything I know about him, but there were some where he denied having done that, at least initially.
So when he told the police and he told counsel that he didn't have sex with them, you decided that he had sex.
I noticed that as continuing information evolved, remember I insisted I be kept updated, that he began, as he was pressed, to give more information. I know as a clinician that when I'm working with patients, you got to confront them because you're probably not going to all get it at the beginning. I had a high index of suspicion that the more time people would spend asking him questions, and I knew they'd spend the time, and I'd get the information, the more likely we would hear somewhat more. So I wasn't surprised to hear some of the earlier ones. He said he hadn't had sex. He began to say that. And as I say, that one bit of information in terms of this big picture wouldn't have been very critical to me.
But you never took the time to push him like a clinician to get his answer, whether he had sex with Bredehoft or not, did you?
I did not push it on that.
And the other people that he didn't have sex, you didn't take the time to ask him, did you have sex?
I went through, as I've said to you, this whole list with him. This was the last guy at that point that I'm going by memory here that I think I really needed to push him on that one. As I recall it, I don't think I tried to push him on it.
What about Weinberger? You know who Weinberger is?
Well, again, I know who they all are, but not by number. And I apologize again. It's terrible to just have people who have been killed and have numbers. But if you want to ask me specifically and refresh my memory,
I used his name Weinberger. I didn't use him a number.
He's one of the people near the end. He's one of the people, as I recall, where there have been two bodies there at once. But if you want to ask me a question, I can turn to that, and I'm glad to respond to the question.
Pardon?
I say, if you want to ask me a question about him, I'll be glad to try to answer.
Did he have sex with him after death?
Well, again, You made the point you want me to check, and I'll check. Okay, he's victim number, I'm sorry, he's the person that's listed here under number 15. In the copy I have here, he says no.
No. He told the police and he told counsel he didn't have sex after death with Weinberger. Is that correct?
That's correct, and I said he had said that in some of these cases that he hadn't.
But you believe he did, Doctor, do you?
I have a high, it's not crucial to the issues here, but I have a high index of suspicion that there may have been a bit more activity after death with some of the cases than he's talked about.
Are you basing your opinion on some suspicion that you have a high index of suspicion that is contrary to what he has told the police and counsel? Are you premising your decision that although it says no on Weinberger and no on Bredehoff with respect to sex after death, you're deciding yes on those two and rendering it?
I said I had a high index of suspicion. I didn't say yes. Based on my clinical experience, when it comes down to these very kind of intimate and potentially embarrassing details, usually as you press people and get to know them better, you get a bit more information. Now, as I said in the beginning, I said this, in terms of the big picture, in terms of the issues that need to be addressed here, I think the essence of what this was about is out there. I do believe as a clinician that if we push for some details of this sort, there may be a bit more we'd get if we continue to push. That's my index of suspicion.
So you're premising, just so the jury understands, you're premising your decision, what your opinion on some suspicions you have about what the answers would be if you had taken more time.
No, sir. I just made it very clear that in terms of the issues before the court today, I didn't think this was terribly important one way or another. I said that very clearly.
Whether he had sex after death? You just said you were so sure that he preferred him dead.
You're not letting me answer. The answer is once I see all of this that's gone on, I see the forest. If there were particular instances where maybe he did or didn't have sex, that one tree isn't there, it's still going to be a forest. So I have clearly come to the conclusion that this guy is necrophilia, that he is turned on sexually to a variety of very sick acts with dead bodies. If it turns out that I'm right and later he says he'd had a bit more, or if I'm wrong and he turns out he had a bit less, it isn't going to do anything to change the big issue of does he have the diagnosis, and I don't think it's going to be anything to change the issue of whether or not he lacks substantial capacity. Now, if we take it away, if we take all the trees away, it won't be a forest, but that's a long ways from saying that that's happening.
So there's two bodies that he didn't have sex with after death. Is that correct?
I think he may have said 3 or 4. Again, I'm going by memory. I didn't feel that was the critical issue in looking at that big picture.
Tell us, then you gave that no weight in considering whether you don't want to use the word prefer. I'm going to use it anyways. I'm a lawyer and a citizen. You gave that no weight in deciding whether he preferred sex before death or after death.
I considered, in light of all this, whether it was very important and felt that in view of everything else that I knew, it wasn't terribly important in terms of these issues.
Just so the jury knows, they may be wondering, just so that we all know, have you decided in your mind that he had sex with Bredehoff, even though all the reports say no?
Obviously, I don't know for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if he later said there had been some sexual activity. That's my only point.
Have you decided whether or not he had sex with Weinberger?
Well, again, it's going to be the same. I don't know if he had. I just know out of my experience that he may reveal some more details of that sort, and it wouldn't come as a shock to me.
Is Weinberger one of the people that he alleged to have drilled? You know?
I'm not positive.
Do you want to check it?
Well, unless I'm missing it, I don't see here that he was. Well, again,
You're relying on no notes of your own. You're looking to count what counsel gave you? Is that
well, at this point, I thought that what I'd been, that's what I'm doing now, yes.
fine? Go ahead. What do you find?
Well, I didn't see in the notes that I'm looking at now that,
Let me read it, Doctor, okay?
okay, I'm not,
Method of death, follow-up for victim 15. Method of death. Number 15, it says follow-up for victim 15.
Follow-up, which number?
I think it must be number 2, I believe.
3 follow-up.
yeah, what
Do you see
we
this
have,
portion? It says method of death, like 3 other previous victims didn't want to kill. Do you agree with that, or do you think he did want to kill?
I'm sorry, I apologize, but I'm lost as to where you're
I've got
at.
it listed
I'm
as
not sure.
page 52, victim 15.
And we may not be looking at the same thing, which may be the basis for the confusion. I don't see any page number on here, so I'm not sure we're looking at the same thing.
It's victim 15, Jeremiah Weinberger.
Right, I see that. Mine says follow-up for victim 15. But
There's the second page, method of death. You see method of death in the second page?
I don't see that.
Can I go up and
Yeah.
I know what Mr. McCann has, and it's accurate, but I just want to make sure the doctor has the same thing. Okay.
Oh, okay, well, I see, I'm sorry, I see where it says method of death. I'm sorry, I don't, there isn't a page number, but it starts out like 3 other previous victims. Is that what we're?
Didn't want to kill. Let me ask, do you agree with that statement that he didn't want to kill, or do you think he did want to kill?
I believe he wanted to kill.
His statements, and he made statements to a number of psychiatrists and to police. He flatly said to police that he didn't want to kill them.
I believe he may have convinced himself at that time that he didn't, but I don't believe in looking at this big picture, that if that person had just said, I'm staying, that person would have been safe. So, one of my jobs as a psychiatrist is to look at it. At times, I'm going to say, gee, what he says is right, makes sense. But if in terms of the bigger picture, he tells me, gee, the only reason I killed this guy is going to leave, and he's been getting guys up there, and one after the other, whenever he gets them secluded, he kills them, I'm going to be pretty skeptical.
I think what they're speaking to, he's speaking to particularly by drilling them, that he didn't want to kill them.
Oh,
Do you accept
okay.
that, or do you not?
I accept that he wanted to sustain people in this zombie-like state between life and death. Yes, I believe he was trying to do that.
Do you think he was doing that because he preferred them in that zombie-like state against preferring them dead?
Well, again, you're using the word prefer. I think that he was very excited by this theme of having someone in that state where, in a sense, it sounds awful, but it's sort of the body's there and the soul's there, but the mind isn't. That's the sense of how he seemed to be seeing these people.
Right. Let's refer to the medical term alive and dead. We'll use the Harvard criteria, okay?
Right.
All right. Brainstem dead. Now, does he prefer the zombie or the brainstem dead body?
I'm not sure what's more arousing for him in terms of that. He's certainly very aroused when they're dead and very aroused at the idea and fantasy that they're in the zombie state. They're both very, very powerful, powerfully arousing for him in my judgment.
And did he choose the opportunity to kill Mr. Weinberger? Do you know from the facts?
I'm not sure what you mean by choose the opportunity.
Well, after the drilling, what happened? Do you know the facts?
My recollection is that Mr. Weinberger died and that what he said was he was disappointed at the death.
Mr. Weinberger lived, at least according to Mr. Dahmer's statement, for over a day, didn't he?
Yes.
Mr. Dahmer went to work and came back?
Correct, and was very disappointed to find him dead, and as I said, expressed remorse and was disappointed that he had passed away.
Well, there's some indication, at least to one of the psychiatrists, that he found him, when he returned the first day, found him still alive.
Yes, my recollection is that the first time he was still alive, he had hoped to be able to sustain him, and then had gone out, and then when he came back the second time, he was dead. And again, my recollection is that he stated that he was very disappointed. In fact, I think he used stronger terms than that, it hadn't worked. At other times, he was talking about how disappointed he was that this whole business of being able to create someone who would live in this state had not succeeded.
And he had, in terms of he had actually attacked the frontal lobe, he knew where the brain center was it not?
Well, I mean, knows anatomy. The frontal lobe is not up here, and I don't think he knows anatomy the way perhaps a physician would. But he was, God, he was dumping fluid in the brain that was going all over the brain.
Right. And in terms of there's this concept of the sex slave is sometimes seen in the pornographic literature, is it not? A person that's a slave one way or another, either by persuasion or in some other fashion, restraint, some other fashion, becomes a sexual, in effect, on call sexually for another individual. Are you familiar with such figures in the literature?
There are such themes out there in what you're referring to as the pornographic literature.
You've indicated in our discussion in general, he has at least stated to the police that he did not enjoy the killing, that he did not take pleasure in killing. Am I accurate? And I don't want to mislead you. Would that be a fair summary of the police reports?
Yes, I think he's been consistent in saying that the actual killing and taking of the life was not something that was pleasant for him.
And do you, however, believe that it was something that was pleasant for him?
No, I don't believe that.
I thought you had said with respect to Mr. Weinberger that you had ventured something to that effect, that he took pleasure in the killing.
No, I said I thought that he got a great deal of excitement out of individuals, including Mr. Weinberger, both in the dead state as well as in that zombie-like state that we're talking about, but I don't believe I said anything beyond that.
And did you agree then that he did not enjoy the killing?
I've seen no evidence to suggest that he enjoyed the killing itself.
He spoke of inhibitions against the killing, didn't he?
There were places where he used those words, as I recall, yes.
And those are as conscience, in effect, throwing up a barrier saying, don't do it. Am I right? What inhibitions are?
You're right that would be one way of looking at the term inhibition.
Right. And did you understand him that that's what he was talking about, that he had inhibitions? Conscience was saying, don't kill this man?
Not throughout. He, as I said, there were, after that killing where he woke up in the hotel, what he had told me is he kind of felt beaten by it, and the term he used was that he was then on automatic palate, and it wasn't clear to me after that there was much in the way of inhibition or conscience. He just seemed to be going almost out of habit, in my judgment, at that point.
Well, there were long breaks in the habit, weren't there, Doctor?
Well, in any habit, you can see that, and the answer to your question is yes.
Yeah. And during those times, was he responsible when he was not killing people? Would you say that he was responsible during those times?
Well, there's no way of answering a question of whether he's responsible for an act that he didn't do at some time when he wasn't doing it.
Were the fantasies continuing, Doctor, about killing?
Absolutely.
Was he masturbating, thinking about it, Doctor?
It is my belief that he was, yes.
But he was controlling himself and not killing, wasn't he?
I believe that there were factors that were helping to keep him in control, and so I would quibble with you a little bit on that.
What were the factors?
Well, for example, when he was in the military and there was a certain structure in place, one of the things we do in treatment is try to structure people's time. And again, I don't mean to trivialize here, but I did use examples purposely of things like eating. I wasn't trying to be snide, but if you won't let me leave this room, you're not going to know I got a problem with overeating because you're controlling me. It isn't a test of whether I can control myself. If I go out of the room and I have the problem and there's no external controls, that's the test. So there are times in his life where I think there were factors going on around him. I also mentioned before the killing in Milwaukee that I think he was really struggling as best he could at that time. So all those, I think, played into the equation. I didn't want to just oversimplify it in answering your question.
I put it, Doctor, from the time that he killed Mr. Hicks until the night in late November, that was in 1978, yes. June probably of 1978, until November of 1987. You certainly aren't suggesting that he had no opportunity to kill if he had wished, are you?
No, nor was I asked to address any issues of criminal responsibility at a time when nothing criminal of this nature was happening. I've answered questions in terms of what I've been directed to do, the time span with respect to the charges that are here before the court.
But you ventured, sir, you ventured on direct that the Hicks slaying was under that also was under this fantasy. Is that correct?
It is correct, but I did not state an opinion that he was not criminally responsible for that first slaying. I did not render an opinion regarding the Toomey case, the Ambassador Hotel case here in Milwaukee.
This is going to go on for a while, Judge. I think it'll be the natural time. I think you have a 5 o'clock here with some other business. I do, sir.
We'll recess then until, as far as testimony is concerned, until 8:30 tomorrow morning. There is a hearing that's scheduled that does involve this case, scheduled for 5 o'clock. I don't know if all the participants are here yet or not, but we'll take a short recess and then we'll get on with that. Okay. What? They're in, okay. Court's in recess.